After learning exactly how asynchronous JavaScript works behind the scenes, over the next couple of lectures, we're going to learn how it can be used in practice in our code. So in this lecture, we're going to take a close look at asynchronous JavaScript with callbacks, which is the more traditional way of dealing with asynchronous code. So let's get rid of this code here, but instead of deleting it, I will simply comment it out, okay? So that we keep it here like for future reference, okay? And you can do the same, or you can delete it, you can do it however you feel like, okay? Now, in order to learn about asynchronous JavaScript with callbacks, we're going to build a very small fake recipe reader, okay? And here we're going to simulate AJAX calls to get some fake recipes using set timeouts. So basically, we're going to simulate loading data from a remote web server, which of course would be asynchronous using some timers, like we did in the last lecture. Okay, so let's create a function here called getRecipe. And then down here, we call that function. Now, the way this is going to work is that we simulate first that we get a bunch of recipe IDs from a server, and then based on that, we select a recipe and then get that recipe from a server after that. Okay, so first we get a couple of IDs and then we get a recipe. So again, we're going to use the setTimeout function here, as I mentioned before, basically to simulate the AJAX call, so the call to get the data from the server. So our callback function here, and then let's say this is going to take 1500 milliseconds. So 1.5 seconds. Then in here, let's simply create an array of recipe IDs. And then some numbers. It doesn't really matter here. Okay, and then let's just console log these. And just to see if everything is working, we are reloading it here. And yeah, so after 1.5 seconds, then this code here appears on the screen. Okay, and again, this set timeout here is just to simulate that this data here comes back from a server. Now, once the data comes back from the server, we then want to get the recipe for one of these IDs. Okay, and so in here, we now need another set timeout, right? Okay, so basically after we receive this data here from the server, then we need a new set timeout where then the data comes from the server for the recipe. Okay, and once more, this doesn't really come from the server, of course. All of this is just to simulate the asynchronous behavior. And don't worry, in one of the future lectures, of course, we're going to use a real API and real AJAX calls. But for now, we don't want to mess with all that. And so we just use the set timeouts to simulate that behavior. Okay, here let's just put 1 second, and actually into the setTimeout function, we can pass a third argument, which can be an argument to the callback function. So let's say we want an ID argument in this callback function here. So ID, and then we can pass a value here as a third argument, and that will then be passed into the callback function. Okay, so let's then use the recipe IDs that we got from the server in the beginning. Okay, and so now basically this recipe ID 2, which will be 432, which will then be passed into this callback function here as ID. All right, so let's create a fake recipe here in this callback function. And we're going to use an object. So this recipe will be fresh tomato pasta. And then let's also add a publisher. And that will be Jonas. Okay, so that's the fake recipe. Now let's just log it to the console. Console.log. And now in here, I actually also want to use this ID. So just to know that everything's working. And so let's use a template string here. So one of the new ES6 features here as well. And remember, if you want to use one of the variables, then we use the $ and curly brackets ID and close the curly brackets. And then we can just write our code. So we say the ID and then just the title of the recipe. So recipe.title. And that's it. And now let's check out if it works. So after 1.5 seconds, this one here comes, and then after 1 second, we get the recipe. And so basically we chained these two timers one after another by putting this one here inside of the first one. So we have the first set timeout, and then in there we have a new set timeout. And like this, the first one runs, and then after 1.5 seconds we get this data, and then after yet another second we then get this fake recipe here. And you also see that the 432 here is actually being passed into this callback function here, just like I said, because we passed it here as a third argument into the set timeout function. Okay, just to see again if this works here, maybe you didn't get the timing here. Let's take a look here at this again. So 1.5, and now 1 second, and here we go. And now just to make things a little bit more complex, let's just add a third level. And let's suppose that we want to get another recipe from the same publisher. So in this case here it's Jonas, and so let's pretend that we want to get another recipe which is also from the same publisher automatically. And so now we use another set timeout with yet another callback function. Okay, so set timeout again. And now we also want an argument here again. And actually we don't even need these parentheses here, right? Remember that with the arrow functions, if we have only one argument, then we don't need to use the parentheses at all. Okay, so publisher, and then just a function body. And this one here, maybe after 1500 again. Maybe this one here as well. I thought this was a bit too fast. Let's get rid of the parentheses here as well. So just ID. Okay, and then of course we also have to pass the publisher into this callback function. And just like before, we do it like this. And this one is stored here in the recipe object. Right, so recipe.publisher. Okay, and so let's now create here another recipe. And this one is Italian pizza. And of course the publisher is the same. All right, let's call this one here recipe 2. Okay, so now we have 3 callbacks nested inside one another. Let's just check if this works. So the IDs, then the first recipe, and now the related recipe from the same publisher, and here we go. And so basically this now is like having 3 chained AJAX calls to get some data from the server. But you see that this is getting here a bit out of hand. Imagine that we had more and more and more chaining here, like 10 levels. Then we would have all of these callbacks here inside of one another. And that is the so-called callback hell in JavaScript. So this triangular shape here that you have here, so this shape here, what I mean here, this triangular shape that we have here, that is a sign of the callback hell, which simply means that we have callback inside of callback inside of callback, which after some time gets really unmanageable. Okay, it gets really messy. And so that's why in ES6, something called promises were introduced. And with promises, we can avoid all of this callback hell here and have a nicer and cleaner syntax when using asynchronous JavaScript like we have here in this example. Okay, and so in the next lecture, we are actually going to look at promises, which is one of the ES6 features that we didn't really talk about in the last section where we talked about ES6 or ES 2015. Okay, so make sure that you understand the logic behind this here, that you really understand what the callback hell really means, because that's a term that you're going to find frequently when you're reading about JavaScript on the web. Okay, so I had to show you what callback hell here is, so that after that it makes sense to you why we use promises.